Moment there. Good evening, everybody. My name is Markus O'Brien-Fehr. I am Councillor John Filion's Chief of Staff. I would like to welcome you all to our virtual town hall session tonight on multiplex housing. This is the third in our Let's Talk Willowdale series of virtual town halls that we've been hosting this month to talk about some of the big issues that are coming to City Council over the coming months. And of course, one of the biggest issues we have as a city and really as a country at the moment is the question of affordable housing. So this week we have been tackling that topic, looking through two different lenses. The session that we did on Monday night was on affordable housing and looking at different forms of affordable housing that the city could proceed with to help deal with the affordability crisis. Today we are going to look at impacts on our residential neighborhoods and what different types of housing forms might do to help alleviate costs, create more options for homeowners, and look at the home ownership side of the spectrum in particular, and the impacts that will have on all of us that are living in local neighborhoods already. So with us tonight, we have a wonderful panel led by our City Councillor for Ward 18 Willowdale, John Filion. I would also like to introduce Melanie Melnick, Lillian D'Souza, and Philip Parker, all of whom work in the City of Toronto's Planning Division. Lillian in particular, I believe, is working with outreach and engagement. So joining us tonight is part of an ongoing effort to start doing some consultation on some of the multiplex questions. And Melanie and Philip have been working on the policy side and are going to share some of their thoughts and insights tonight. Before we get into the topic, I would like to start with the land acknowledgement, acknowledging that the land we are meeting on, even if virtually tonight, is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I won't spend a lot of time getting into a further introduction of what we're going to be talking about tonight. I think I'm going to leave that to our panel of experts. I will say that if you weren't able to be with us Monday for the first talk about affordable housing, that should be popping up on the councillor's website, johnfilion.ca, later this week. It was a great conversation with senior staff, the city's housing secretariat, and also planning staff talking about some of those affordable housing options. But again, tonight we want to tackle this other end of the housing spectrum and one that may have a little bit more of a direct impact on residents in our community. Couple of housekeeping notes before I get some thoughts from our panel. Want to make sure that everybody participating tonight knows that we are recording the meeting, and we will do that so that this will live on as a resource for others in the community that may be interested in the issue and learning more about what's happening from a policy perspective in the City of Toronto. As we work through, going to do some presentations from our panel. I have some questions for them, and probably we'll have a few more after we see the presentation tonight, some of the big questions that we might anticipate on these topics. And then I'm going to turn it over to our participants, our audience, and would love to make this very interactive, have you ask any questions, add any comments that you might be thinking about. And you can do that two ways tonight. On the right-hand side of your screen, you should see a raise hand icon. If you're comfortable speaking live with our panel and asking your question, you'll have an opportunity to do that by clicking the raise hand icon. And Jesse James, who's working with us on the back end from our office, will happily unmute you at the appropriate time so you can ask your question. If you're feeling a little bit more shy and would rather type in your question in the Q&A box, you'll find that on the right-hand side of your screen as well. So look for the Q&A. You can type in a question at any time, and as we get to the Q&A session midway through the presentation tonight, we will go to those as well as to any raised hands that we see. So with that, I am going to invite Councillor John Filion to open things up with a few thoughts on multiplex housing. Go ahead, John.
Yes, thank you, Markus. So thanks everybody for coming out tonight. This is a really important subject for a lot of reasons. The first being that, we do need to do something to increase the supply of different forms of housing in neighborhoods. But I think it's fair to say that what is being proposed would be, if adopted, a major change in places like Willowdale, probably equivalent in scope to when, the change that came when Mel announced that he wanted a downtown North York, and we saw a lot of big buildings coming up on Yonge Street, probably equivalent to the change when builders started knocking down the older bungalows and putting up large new houses. So it's a very large proposed change. It's really important to me that everyone understand what's being proposed and have a chance to ask questions about it. I'm very interested in hearing your opinions on it, and in the course of that, happy to give you some of mine. Thanks, Markus.
All right, thank you, John. So if you are have been participating in some of our previous Let's Talk Willowdale virtual town halls, you may be in for a little bit more of a debate or discussion tonight. You will hear some different perspectives, I think, from our panel, from the staff that have been working on some of the policy proposals, to John, who is going to voice, I think, some concerns and want to make sure that some of the big questions are being asked in terms of impact on neighborhoods. But I think we can move into some of the specifics in terms of what we're talking about. I will perhaps turn things over to Lillian. I'm not sure which member of the team is sort of going to do the opening presentation to set the framework for the discussion we're going to have tonight.
Thank you so much, Markus. Yeah, I'll just share my screen. Okay, are you able to see me okay?
Yes, looking good.
See the slide deck? Okay, great. Thank you so much for having us, and thank you so much, Councillor Filion, for organizing this meeting with your team so that we can continue having these conversations on multiplex housing. We did start the conversation in July 2020 when Council gave us a direction to undertake expanding housing options in neighborhoods, and then in continuing through November 2021 when we released the multiplex proposals report to Planning and Housing Committee. Before I get going, I just wanted to draw attention to this cover slide, which we love using because it really shows the way growth has happened in the city of Toronto. You have the downtown, you have the avenues and centers that have, the tall towers popping up everywhere. And then majority of the lands you can see is fairly low rise, and that's the way our growth strategy has played out over the years. But we'll move on to what EHON is and what we are trying to do. So what are we talking about when we talk about the expanding housing options in neighborhoods? This is the missing middle typology. So these refer to the detached. These refer to the low-rise buildings that are under 4 stories. So you have the fourplexes, the triplexes, townhouses, stack downs, and the low-rise apartment buildings. We're not talking about mid-rise buildings. Those are different. They are a different typology, and those are the ones that we see on avenues. So this is a where of EHON. This is the city's land use map. It demonstrates where growth is happening, where employment happens, where we are protecting natural lands in the green. But the area that we're talking about for the expanding housing options are the yellow. These are the lands that are designated as neighborhoods in the official plan, and they have been fairly stable over the last many years, many decades. But the intent of the neighborhoods is that they are stable but not static. That means that they are expected to change over time, and they are expected to also accommodate growth. So this is the scope of EHON. There are many initiatives that are part of the expanding housing options. I'll just go over them fairly quickly because I know we wanted to keep the presentation tight. But the core initiatives are on the left of your screen. So you have the multiplex housing, which we're here to talk about today. We also have the Garden Suites program, a pilot program in Ward 19, where we're using a city-owned site to demonstrate what a missing middle project could look like. Major street rezoning. These are on the major streets in Toronto, as identified on map 3 of the official plan. We're happy to share that map later on. And there's also a locally serving retail and services component to this, to the expanding housing options. So these are things like a small greengrocer, a cafe, things that are you can walk to in neighborhoods, which would reduce the dependency on cars and car trips, which makes a community more sustainable. We're also contemplating official plan amendments to Chapter 4 of the official plan. Chapter 4 is on neighborhoods, and this is where we will be introducing some of the amendments that we're looking at through expanding housing options, where to expand permissions for the different types of housing, multiplexes, low-rise apartments, and so on. There's the metrics testing and monitoring program. So that's on the top right. And there's many components to this, but one example is the Garden Suites monitoring program that was introduced when Council adopted the Garden Suites official plan amendment and zoning bylaw amendment, which is currently under appeal and not in force. But as part of that adoption, Council asked staff to monitor the program to ensure that the any building permits that were issued to build Garden Suites were in keeping with the zoning bylaw amendments, and where, if variances were requested, to what extent they were changing the amendments that staff had recommended. So monitoring work is very much a part of the expanding housing options program. And then finally, there's the identifying barriers and opportunities piece. In many cases, it is very expensive to build missing middle housing. There are many parts of the city where multiplexes, for example, are permitted, but they are not financially feasible. So we are looking at those barriers to entry for homeowners to possibly convert their houses into multiplexes or low-rise apartment buildings, and exploring ways to support homeowners in these endeavors. There's also a parking review, also in November 2021, which was adopted by Council, where there are no minimum parking requirements for any type of missing middle housing, and that's in keeping with the citywide parking permissions right now. All of this is combined with ongoing work to monitor infrastructure, both soft and hard infrastructure, so making sure the community services are adequate, as well as the infrastructure under the ground so that there is enough stormwater capacity, water capacity, etc. All right. So these are the possible outcomes we're looking at. This is just a generic neighborhood block that you might see anywhere across the city, perhaps somewhere in Willowdale. You have a major street with a bus route, some kind of housing along the major streets. You have your interior neighborhood streets as well, with your yards, trees, parks, etc. And these are the types of housing that we were contemplating through the expanding housing options. You have the garden suites in orange. You have local commercial uses in yellow, multiplexes in purple, and then on the main street, you see a more denser form of housing in low-rise apartment buildings and stacked townhouses as well. But when you unhighlight those changes, you'll see that there are a number of units that have been added through just one area in the city without much change to the physical character of the neighborhood. Back of napkin maps has shown us that about 100 units were able to be added to this, and the form and scale of the neighborhood has remained relatively unchanged. So with this, I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues, Melanie and Phil, to talk about multiplex housing.
Filion. I'm Melanie, and together with Phil, we are co-leads of the Multiplex housing team. We work with actually a group of city staff and have been for since the start of this project. And I'll give you a quick overview of the work we've been doing, and we look forward to your questions afterwards. Next slide, please. First, I want to highlight our guiding principles that we brought forward to Council or to Planning and Housing Committee in our November report. And these are the principles that have been guiding our work throughout the study itself. And these guiding principles speak to ensuring that neighborhoods are for everyone. We want to ensure that there's equity, diversity, and inclusivity in our neighborhoods. The slide Lillian showed you with the sort of the aerial shot of Toronto demonstrates that a lot of the new housing that we're seeing being added to Toronto's landscape is in high-rise buildings. And we think there should be additional opportunities as well to allow for people to be able to enjoy the low-rise neighborhoods that make Toronto special. And we recognize in our City of Neighborhoods principle that is a key part of our identity and the diversity that makes Toronto special. And what's really important is that we are looking to maintain a low-rise scale, and DOP, the official plan, defines this as 4 stories or less. So really working within the same scale to fit within the neighborhoods and contribute to the context. Ensuring those changes do result in a green and livable neighborhood, both from a sustainability, environmental lens, but also to make sure that the units that result from this are livable for a variety of households. And finally, the Facilitate Multiplexes principle speaks to looking for ways to remove barriers, to find simplicity in the processes and permissions that guide multiplex and low-rise development in general in the city. Next slide, please. First, we wanted to define what we mean by multiplex housing. This is a house or building that has 2, 3, or 4 units within a single building. And you may also have heard these referred to as duplexes, triplexes, or fourplexes. These may be rental units, but there are instances of small-scale condominiums of this scale. And they might be existing houses that have been subdivided into multiple units, or they might be newly purpose-built to have multiple units inside them. This isn't a new concept in Toronto. It's something that exists all across the city, not just in the downtown, but in many of the streetcar suburbs that developed over time across the city. Next slide, please. So I'm showing you 2 versions of the same map, and on the map on the left is the area of the city where that shows where multiplexes are permitted currently. And so they are permitted in everything on the left that is colored in yellow. The zoning bylaw permits additional units on a property. And the rest of the city that's grayed out doesn't allow for that. And we think there's an opportunity to sort of equalize the permissions across the city so that people have more ability to choose where they want to live, which may be guided by employment decisions or where their families live, so that can be spread across the city as well. And generally speaking, about 96% of the city's neighborhoods are located within walking distance of a TTC subway, streetcar, or bus route. And we took a look at the areas where multiplexes have been permitted and historically found that the rate of change is pretty modest and incremental, and introduces a gentle form of density while making better use of the local infrastructure and amenities that already exist in the neighborhood. Next slide, please. So we're calling our approach to looking at this thinking inside the box. And what this is illustrating is how we can make better use of the existing zoning envelopes that already exist across the city by housing additional units within that same low-rise scale. So what this is showing you in the sort of grayed in box over top of the house is the sort of maximum volume that the zoning bylaw would allow. And to the left is a single unit house. Whereas on the right, some additional changes could be made still within the same scale and permission to allow for up to 3 units in this example to be housed within that same volume. Next slide, please. We've also come to recognize that there are some parts of the zoning bylaw that might need a bit of adjustment to simplify the standards and make it a little bit more equitable, whether you're building a multiplex or a single detached house. So for example, this is one zoning standard that exists today, where in the R zone, which is kind of the most permissive zone that we have in the city, you may build a multiplex, but it can only be 14 meters in depth. And what a single detached house has permission for is 17 meters. So we're showing you this to illustrate that the degree of change is relatively modest and minor, so that that box can accommodate the same kind of volume with additional units that are still livable and workable. And I think with that, I will turn it over to Phil.
Thanks, Melanie. So I'm going to go into a bit of the design work that we've done for multiplexes. So we've been studying a range of typical lot sizes found throughout the city to represent the different types of neighborhoods that we have across Toronto. So for each lot size, we first determine the extent of the permitted building envelope, so the box that you see there, and the building types that fit within the volume. This example shows how a building with the same setbacks, building depth, and height of a detached dwelling can accommodate up to 4 units. And this is one of the examples we chose that has kind of a typical lot size that may be found in parts of North York. Next slide, please. And then to take that a little bit further, we used real neighborhood examples to make sure that we were capturing the different types of neighborhoods, again, that we see in Toronto. So for this example, we have an existing building on Madawaska Avenue. We're looking at the one in the center, the smaller bungalow and we tried to look at this lot to determine what kind of gentle density we could show on this lot while respecting the existing zoning bylaw. So next slide, please. So our urban design team came up with this conceptual new build triplex, which is intended to fit the neighborhood, the scale of the neighborhood. You can see that when we've turned the existing buildings into the sort of boxes there. You can see that it's generally within the same scale as the building to the left. And the setbacks are also consistent with the buildings to the left and right of it, which we'll show on one of the next slides. However, in this example, we've been able to show that you can build 3 reasonably large size units within this triplex, whereas the building next door is a single unit home. So within the same volume, like what Melanie was talking about, we can show that 3 comfortable units can be built. Next slide, please. Then when you zoom out a bit, this is our little diagram showing that the rear and front yard setbacks are consistent with the neighboring properties. The height is within the zoning envelope. And the various performance standards are in line with the rest of the neighborhood. Next slide, please. So the proposed study outcomes, we have 4 major proposed outcomes for our study. The first one is an official plan policy changes to allow multiplexes in all neighborhoods. We released our draft official plan amendment yesterday publicly online, and I'll go into that on the next slide, and we will show you the link to what we are proposing. The second thing we are hoping to accomplish is recommended zoning bylaw changes to the building type and permitted envelopes. This is a longer term goal. We're not looking to do this by our July report. This would happen sometime next year, and it does require extra work to get there. As Lillian mentioned, we're also putting our input into the city fee structures and approval process improvements. So those are things like the development charge regime, parkland dedication fees, and other process improvements that people have identified as making this type of development tricky. And then we're also looking at some areas for further study, such as small scale condo approvals, which we understand are quite difficult due to both provincial and city regulations. Next slide, please. So just want to highlight our draft official plan amendment, which, like I said, was recently made public. These are the real highlights of the amendment. The first is to permit multiplexes in all neighborhoods, as we've highlighted. But while permitting multiplexes in all neighborhoods, we ensure that the continued consideration of the physical context where multiplexes are proposed, whether those be new buildings or converted houses, The amendment also encourages the inclusion of large units with multiple bedrooms and universally accessible units on the ground floor. It directs that soft landscaping be maximized to support tree growth and an overall green character. It encourages sustainable building practices, and it contemplates using density incentives in the zoning bylaw to permit additional units. But as I mentioned, that's subject to ongoing study. We do have a link to the zoning bylaw here, and I'll post it in the chat after this. Next, please. I think it's back to you, Lillian.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much, Phil and Melanie. I just want to briefly go over the ways in which we have engaged and are continuing to engage on the Expanding Housing Options initiative. Because this is a complex issue, we have been using a range of tools and techniques to help us broaden the reach to people who presently live in neighborhoods, but also people who don't live in neighborhoods right now, but who may want to at some point in the future. So you're talking to future neighbors as well. So we've been engaging youth through schools, through universities, through our university partnerships. We have videos and surveys, and we've also been doing stakeholder meetings, both with the development industry for the missing middle type of development, so the small scale developers, and stakeholder meetings such as with the residents associations, grassroots neighborhood groups, etc. There is one block here, which is the EHON Roundtable. And this is something new that we have introduced as part of the engagement strategy for EHON. This is a representative advisory body comprising of a range of interests in the missing middle conversation. They are not a decision-making body. They include, participants like academics, financial analysts, small-scale missing middle developers. So people you would think you would see in the missing middle conversation. But what is different is that we've also included people who have been historically shut out of planning processes, who have been marginalized by planning processes and exclusionary planning processes in the past. So these include newcomers to Canada, youth, Black and racialized communities, as well as Indigenous communities. And they are, we also have a residents association represented on the EHON Roundtable, and it's FONTRA. But all of these diverse opinions are brought into a single action-oriented conversation, and they provide input to staff on ongoing policy ideas, draft amendments, as well as on the engagement strategy. In the month of May, some of the members, the equity-focused members, will be engaging their communities on behalf of the city and bringing the feedback back to the city, thereby broadening the reach to communities we may not have reached otherwise. So as I mentioned, the engagement program has been running for a few years now, since July 2020. But I'm just giving you a few highlights of the many ways we've engaged on expanding housing options. In November 2021, when the Multiplex report was going, the proposals report was going to Planning and Housing Committee, we also had a survey that was out. That survey was very successful. We had more than 7,700 responses from across the city. We've also been engaging on the Garden Suite survey through a video. So that wrapped up when Council adopted Garden Suites. We have our e-update list, and that's the best way to stay in touch with the process. You can sign up for our e-updates at www.toronto.ca/EHON. We'll send updates on engagement events and when reports are going to committee and council. We've also been streamlining engagement events and piggybacking on ongoing engagement. So, for example, our Plan Toronto is the Municipal Comprehensive Review. They're also engaging in the community. And we do attend those meetings as well, just because people are already gathered there, and we want to reduce the burden on communities to show up for multiple city meetings. So we do try to streamline as much as possible. This includes meetings with residents associations. If we have any AGMs, we also show up there. Just trying to show up where people are already gathered. In February 2022, we had a series of ward-based meetings. And then we just wrapped up our district roadshow in April of this year, trying to have conversations at the local level and then bring it up to the citywide level. This is a summary of the consultation we've done in April alone. As I mentioned, the district roadshow, the meeting we had in North Rock was on April 5th. We had 2 citywide meetings on multiplexes and local commercial uses. One was offered in the evening and one was offered in the daytime if people couldn't join the evening meeting. We've also tried some new techniques such as using Reddit. We had an Ask Me Anything or an AMA on April 6th, which was very successful and a lot of fun. And then we had a Twitter Spaces on April 27th. The EHON Roundtable usually meets monthly, and this month they commented on the local commercial uses on April 8th, as well as on major streets on April 26th. Just to wrap up very quickly, these are the key takeaways from this presentation. We didn't really go into the policy at this meeting, but there is policy support both in the provincial plans, the growth strategy, as well as the official plan for expanding housing options. Many of the forms we're considering already align with the existing and permitted scale of neighborhoods. A series of reports will be presented to Council through the remainder of the term and beyond into 2023. There's lots of opportunities for outreach and conversation. EHON comprises just one piece of the overall housing affordability challenge, and will contribute to that one part of it. And this is a long-term planning initiative. The change in neighborhoods is still anticipated to be gradual. So very quickly, also next steps, we have the reports on multiplex housing and local commercial uses coming in July 2022. Ongoing consultation. We're looking at developing a best practices or how-to guides for garden suites and laneway suites. And the EHON Roundtable will continue to meet and further reporting in 2023 on the official plan amendments to Chapter 4, neighborhoods, on major streets and other work. So this is our contact information if you'd like to stay in touch with us. Our website is noted here, as well as our email address to reach any members of the team. You can also call us anytime. So that's it. I will stop sharing my screen and hand the floor back to Markus.
All right. Thank you, Lillian. Thank you, Melanie. Thank you, Philip, for that presentation. Lots to unpack there. I know John's going to have some reactions. I'm going to start with some questions and then ask John some questions. And of course, for all of our participants, if you have questions or comments, we're going to invite you to take your turn tonight as well. You can either raise your hand using the icon on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll take your questions live in a few minutes, or you can type something into the Q&A box, and we will queue that up for the panel. Just off the top, I want to make sure that I'm clear on the distinction between low-rise and multiplex, because there were sort of both of those examples sort of on an early slide grouped together, sort of in the context of this conversation. Those are slightly different things, and I want to make sure I'm clear on what we're actually discussing in terms of the context of a residential neighborhood.
Sure, I can take this one. So for our particular project, the multiplex project, we are only looking at duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and not low-rise apartments. There are other parts of our EHON project which are looking at different forms, particularly along major streets. They're looking at low-rise apartment buildings, but right now during our work, we're not looking at apartment buildings.
So the phrase 4 stories or less was used, and I wasn't clear whether that was describing specifically a low-rise apartment or whether that might also apply to a multiplex.
That would apply to everything in neighborhoods. So that's existing neighborhoods policy today in the official plan, generally 4 stories or less.
Okay. So that then could represent a very stark difference depending on how this is implemented. I mean, you have the photographic example of the local bungalow, with the large new home next door. If a multiplex of 4 stories were permitted next door on either side, you could be seeing a fairly significant impact. That's something that would be possible in the framework that you're looking at.
Not immediately, no. We haven't come up with the final zoning, but the thinking inside the box strategy that Melanie highlighted is really about using the existing zoning. So we're not looking at creating permissions for 4 stories everywhere where they don't exist already. It's about using the additional space that already someone could build to, but being allowed to use it for more units.
So the idea is that you could convert a residential unit to a multiplex, but that the built form would have to be very similar to what somebody would be able to build as a single residential home anyway. Do I have that right?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So, one of the terms that gets thrown around, currently when we're looking
Just
at,
on that last point, Marcus, I'm going to say that is incorrect. I have a very different interpretation on that point.
okay, well, why don't you jump in, John, and then share that
Yes, so
interpretation?
you cannot build a four-story house in a neighborhood in Willowdale. The official plan does not allow that. And I was very involved in creating the wording that makes sure that is not allowed. So um, it it may be that theoretically you could, but in fact, right now you could not. Like nobody could create a four-story home on any of these lots we're talking about. So it is, in my opinion, incorrect to say that it is just the same building form and just a change in the number of units. If it were that, I wouldn't have a problem so much with it, but I don't believe that's the case at all.
Sure. So, Councillor, like I said, we're not proposing that you could build up to 4 stories. We are proposing that you could build within the existing zoning envelope, which, as you pointed out, is not 4 stories in Willowdale and most of the city. The 4 stories comes from the neighborhood's policies themselves, which set out like the maximum is 4 stories, but in most areas of the city, most neighborhoods in the city, you can't build up to 4 stories as of right. So we're not
Yes,
proposing that.
but I think you are, because you're taking out all the words that I was involved in putting into the official plan. You're removing those that that talks about the character of the neighborhood, and instead replaces it with the future character of the neighborhood, which is clearly 4 stories. So I I I think we have a difference in interpretation. I'll just leave it at
So
that.
without getting into the specific, impact of the wording, and that'll certainly be an ongoing discussion between councillors and council and planning staff as this continues. I think what I'm trying to drill down on, and what I'm guessing most of our listeners tonight are most concerned about is, what is the intent of this? And then what are the possible interpretations would sort of be the next question coming out of that. But what I'm hearing from staff tonight is that if a multiplex policy came in citywide, you wouldn't be able to build anything bigger than you could build today. It would just be purposed differently under the new system.
I think if I could jump in, Marcus, the key difference here is the difference between the policy intention of the official plan and the zoning, which will remain a very important planning tool as we continue to review and regulate these. So the official plan policy is certainly important, and our official plan amendment does refer to existing and planned context of a neighborhood. And the plan context really refers to the zoning bylaw. And so if we're looking at the existing sort of zoning envelope, that is what would be the planned context. The existing, so, in the box example, we had a little bungalow that it was 1 story within a box that could accommodate potentially up to 3. So if the bungalow is the existing context, the box is the planned context. So I wonder if that might help make that distinction. And we do, in our official plan amendment, continue to refer to policies that speak to the general character of the neighborhood. But the key difference in our official plan amendment is that the prevailing building type is something that would not facilitate multiplexes. So that's a policy language from the official plan amendment that stands in the way of letting the specific duplex, triplex, fourplex from being more easily brought into neighborhoods.
Okay, so Melanie, you've used the term, or the phrase "character of a neighborhood." John was using it earlier. I mean, I think that's a key part of this discussion, and coming at it from a Willowdale context, where over the last 2 decades we have had many an aggressive infill housing application trying to push the upper limits of what is possible to be built in local neighborhoods. I'm sure there is going to be a knee-jerk reaction concern coming from many residents that this opens the floodgates and creates something very, very different than what we have currently. That may be some of John's concern. So John, I'm going to get to you in a second to ask about your interpretation of character of a neighborhood and how that might apply here. But from the policy perspective, I mean, what are the safeguards that your team might be looking at to make sure that, if this policy change were enacted, that existing characters, the existing character of our neighborhoods would be protected through that process?
Sorry. I'm still unmuted, so I'll start. I guess I would just go back to zoning being the key regulator in enforcing and ensuring that character. And what the zoning bylaw does is it sets a consistent setback, for example, from front yards. It sets a lot coverage ratio that would ensure that there's a continued minimum soft landscaping and specific setbacks between houses so that there's appropriate spaces between units. So those are all the things that we use to regulate sort of the built form of a building and respond to the existing context. And there are, there's a variety of other features that the official plan talks about, like lot patterns and lot sizes and the street pattern and that kind of thing, that, as far as this official plan amendment is concerned, if adopted, would still continue to take into account.
Okay.
To that, sorry, can I just add
Sure.
to that as well, Marcus?
Jump in, Lily.
As part of the expanding housing options work, as I mentioned, monitoring is a big part of the work as well. So we do monitor the building permits that are issued. Even if they're as of right, we do collect them. So in the case of garden suites and laneway suites, for example, the threshold was set at 200 building permits or 2 years, whichever came first. So once those 200 permits were collected, in the case of laneway suites, there was a consultant who was hired to review all of those building permits to ensure that they were consistent with the standards and the performance standards that the city wanted to see in this type of typology and this type of construction. And if there were variances to those, what those were. So in many cases, there were improvements made, but in some cases, we just want to know what's happening on the ground. But the idea is also to just see what people do within the standards that are set out by the city. In most cases, I think in the case of laneway suites, there were very few variances that were requested, which meant that a majority of them were in line with what the city anticipated to see when the zoning bylaw was introduced. Now garden suites will also have that same monitoring program.
Lillian, you have queued up my next question already that I was going to ask the panel. You jumped ahead on me. I want to talk a little bit more about those limits and how that might be set up to work. First, I want to come back to John, though, on the question of character of a neighborhood. John, you've done a lot of work throughout your career on ensuring that there is planning language that respects that element of our neighborhoods. Do you want to talk for a moment about why that's important to you and why this sort of gives you concern, sort of seeing how this is shaking out?
Sure. Well, I'll preface this by saying I'm not opposed to change, and in fact have had come to embrace the notion that we needed to start doing things differently. And when this was first proposed, the idea of a multiplex study, knowing that studies sometimes kind of get away from you, I had a meeting with the chief planner to talk about, what exactly are you intending here? And I was told that it would be, kind of slow and measured, and was extremely startled today to see that's not what it is. That's certainly not my interpretation of what it is. The I think it is not correct to describe this. I don't think we're getting a full explanation of the impact of making an official plan amendment change. Planning 101 is that zoning conforms to official plans. So when you make an official plan change that removes the wording that kind of creates a prevailing character for the neighborhood, then you're turning it all upside down. So to get specific to answer your question, when I was, until this term, I was on the planning committee for the entire time I've been on council. And in a previous review of the official plan and related zoning bylaws was very involved and active in that, and in fact proposed the wording that is now being removed, which talks about the prevailing character of neighborhoods, and that new development has to conform with the prevailing character. So if you're living on, I won't name a street, Purple Street, and the prevailing character there is homes on certain sized lots, you can't have somebody say, well, I don't like that, so I'm proposing, something much smaller than that, and run off and appeal it if you get turned down a committee of adjustment and get it approved. And we were seeing a lot of cases where somebody would get something obnoxious approved. It would get approved at the OMB back when they were dealing with the minor variances. And then that would form the pattern. Like the one exception would then kind of be adopted as, oh, well, the OMB approved this, there's nothing we can do. So I brought in a change that said, no, that's not the case. The one doesn't change the character of the neighborhood. You have to look at the prevailing character. Like what is, if you look down a street, what is it most like? What is the character most like? And you need to conform to that regardless of whether something got approved that wasn't that. So I don't know, that's probably too long an explanation, but there you go.
So John, to sum up, would you be okay with the concept of a duplex or a triplex in the envelope of a building that would be permitted today?
Yeah, I think you have to do it carefully, but yes, that's kind of what I thought we were going to see. What I thought we were going to see was something along the edges that would be a bit more permissive. Where you're, for example, if you're backing onto Shepherd Avenue and somebody on Shepherd Avenue is allowed to build a 5 or 6 story building, in some cases even a 7 or 8 story building. If you're backing on to that, maybe your permissions should be a bit more. You should be able to go a little bit higher. That would be to me, a good location for multiplex. But in the heart of the neighborhood, I don't have a problem with more units. I don't think anybody should have a problem with more people or more families being able to live on their street. But that's a far cry. That concept is a far cry from somebody building a 4-story building next to you.
All right. So, John, you've queued up another question, but I now want to go back to the point that Lillian made about having limits on, were this to be introduced, having a cap of the number that could be theoretically built in a given year, similar to what's been agreed to in terms of garden suites.
Sorry, Marcus, just to clarify, there's not a cap of 200 units. The monitoring program kicks in up to 200 units.
Okay.
So,
thank you.
Yeah, at that point is when we collect the data. We say, okay, we will collect the data. We'll analyze these 200 units or whatever comes in within 2 years.
So it triggers a review.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you for that.
Here's a review, but the reviews are always to make things more permissive. You never have a review and then roll things back and make them less permissive. I've certainly never seen one that did that.
Okay. So I'm trying to wrap my head, I guess, around, the map that you put up of the yellow splotches where multiplex houses are, you know, as of right today, and where they would be moving forward. And it's a pretty dramatic change. You talked about wanting to give people options to live in that type of housing throughout the city. That's fair enough. But if we are looking to do this more gradually to, make sure that there aren't any unintended consequences of bringing in this kind of change, John talked about, having an initial zone perhaps closer to avenues where you might have immediate access to transit, or looking at a couple of particular neighborhoods that might be used as pilots. I know there's one underway in the Beach currently, whether that might be entertained in other parts of the city. If we're talking about having limits upon which we would trigger a review, why open this up across the whole city all at once as opposed to doing it in a more measured kind of way?
Maybe I'll start. If that's
Okay, sure.
So, one of the reasons that we are looking to implement this policy citywide is that, like Melanie mentioned, we know that from the areas where multiplexes are currently permitted, their take up is relatively low. It's gradual, it's incremental. And from doing additional work on the financial feasibility of triplexes throughout the city, we know that it's not even feasible in all cases anywhere. A lot of cases, what we see for like the triplex development especially is the ones that we do see, somebody has a reason for wanting this triplex, and it's not necessarily the profit motive. It's like somebody is building a home for their kids who can't afford to build a home of their own, or somebody is adding a floor to their house so that their in-laws can live there. So we really wanted to apply this citywide because we think that the growth will be incremental, and we wanted to take an equitable approach across the city to give people chances to live in the neighborhoods where they grow up, or their parents live, or for whatever reason they want to live. It's close to their jobs. So it's really kind of the equitable approach. And I don't know if Melanie has more to add.
No, I think you summed it up perfectly. I think it's just providing an equitable opportunity for anybody across the city to create these options for themselves, their families, and yes, there will be developers that might want to come in as well, but we think of that as a good outcome because they're in the business of creating units too.
All right, Philip, I'm glad that you raised the question of economics, because I think that's a big part of the conversation, certainly will be from residents in the area. I know in the context of discussing garden suites, there was a lot of concern about, this kind of being brought in the conversation of affordable housing, and people questioning how reasonably affordable any of those units would actually be. So, wondering, just from the economics of it, would a duplex or triplex type of unit in Willowdale, where would that fall into the conversation of affordable housing, if it does at all? And, is there a risk that by changing the zoning, you make some of these properties more attractive to builders or developers, and somebody trying to buy a single family home is suddenly being bid up by a developer wanting to put in a triplex?
I think that's a fair question, Marcus. And I think the chief planner himself would tell you that we recognize this is the EHON initiative is just one piece of the puzzle, and it's not going to solve the affordability issue with this initiative. And we acknowledge that, because really what we're looking to do is create sort of more market rental opportunities so that it's adding to the supply that's lacking right now. So I think it's just a question of a number of different approaches, and it's everything from housing now to modular homes to rapid housing on one end of the spectrum, whereas this is kind of geared more towards adding units at the market rate. So in terms of, how like part of the reason why I think units are, tend to get expensive in this model is because they have a number of process barriers to face. And so if they intend to go to committee of adjustment to try to build a multiplex in a zone that is currently not permitted, and their only variance is that they're a multiplex and you're in a single detached zone, then they still have to go through their process of going to C of A and having that review, going to get their building permit, and all of that time is sunk into the land cost of carrying their property. So that's another factor that drives up the cost of housing as well. So what we are trying to do is to kind of streamline the process so that it's a little simpler for someone to potentially get a building permit. We've also been working with some other external groups to the city to understand how these units, whether they're even financially viable. And so doing sort of a pro forma model to understand, what it would take or what the factors would need to be to still make it a sort of reasonable house with reasonable rent on the units. So that's part of our analysis as well.
All right. And John, I mean, you have talked extensively throughout your career on impacts of land speculation and how the unintended consequences of planning changes can impact that issue that in turn impacts affordability of home ownership for people looking to buy a home. What's your take on the affordability issue and any concerns that you have as this might relate to land speculation?
Yeah, well, there's two. While it is undoubtedly true that if you have more smaller units, they are individually going to sell or rent for more than, one large unit or fewer large units. So I think that's kind of indisputably true. And I would agree that because of that, we do need a greater variety of types and forms of housing close to the ground, something in between a high rise and, a 3,600 square foot new home with one family in it. But ask the question again, Marcus. Sorry, I went a bit off there.
That's okay. I'm just trying to tease out any concerns that you have about how this might impact land speculation.
Yeah. So what I'm concerned about is we spend a lot of time trying to uphold the zoning bylaws in Willowdale because it's very different than the rest of the city, and sometimes the city planners don't understand the differences. And in most parts of the downtown or most parts of the city, somebody puts put a smaller, older house up for sale, and somebody will buy it to live in. That doesn't happen in Willowdale. If you have a relatively new or a large home, somebody will buy it to live in. But otherwise, it's bought by land speculators or builders. And there's nothing wrong with people making a profit or having a profit motive, but it's that totally drives the housing market and what gets built in Willowdale. And so most of what I would see if we are not careful with how we do this is a whole pile of unintended consequences, both in terms of land speculation, but in terms of builders trying to use these new rules to their advantage. Like if you can, like right now, you're only allowed to build a 2-story new home, but if you're allowed to build a 4-story multiplex and you go to committee of adjustment and say, I want 3 full stories or I want 4 stories, and I'm asking for this variance because I could build a whole multiplex, but I'm not. I'm just going to build a 4-story house. You're going to start getting 4-story houses or 3-story houses That could be a good thing or a bad thing, but you have to think it through. It shouldn't be an unintended consequence. Or if you are concerned about side yards, and we try to, hold the line at 4 feet for side yards with new houses, if you allow semis, which I have some sympathy to allowing, but then somebody comes in and says, well, I only want to provide 1.5 foot side yards or 2 foot side yards because after all, I could build a semi and there'd be no side yard. So you just have to foresee all of that stuff and protect against it.
Yeah, all right. Thanks, John. I've got just one more question, and then we're going to go to the audience. There's a number of questions that have come into the question box already, so we'll get to those. If anybody does want to ask the panel a question live, raise your hand, and we'd love to bring you on and get you into this conversation. My last question, I just want to pick up on a point that you made, John, about having more people in the middle of a residential neighborhood, and should neighbors care about whether they have more people there or not. And my guess is a concern that we will hear in this neighborhood, in the context of a neighborhood where, it's virtually impossible for kids to get into local schools, or to find a space in local childcare centers, or to get kids into swimming lessons. You can tell I'm a dad, sort of focused on a lot of the kid impacts of trying to find spaces for programs in the neighborhood that, in many cases have been overwhelmed because there hasn't been a particularly strong linkage between the growth of the population in this area and the delivery of local services. So I'm wondering whether there has been any thought given to that piece of it. I mean, high-rise development, there are development charges, there are, used to be Section 37, now, some version of community benefit charges to help the city deal with those sorts of pressures. Would there be any linkages between multiplex housing, potential spikes in population in a particularly hot neighborhood that might accommodate this type of housing, and dealing with some of the overcapacity issues that already exist?
Great question, Marcus. I'll start, Phil, and then you're welcome to fill in. I think what we found in the research that we undertook, we took a look at the R zoning, and I mentioned this earlier. That's a zone where you could build, as of right, a multiplex today. And we looked over the last 10 years of Committee of Adjustment data, and found that there were really only about 200 or some odd applications that involved adding units via multiplex over 20 years. Now, I can't foresee the rate of growth, but we are, that tells us that even where it's currently permitted, that we anticipate the growth to be incremental, and that, I don't anticipate that you would see a spike in population. I think that typically more occurs when you have sort of a new high-rise, a new mid-rise building, but that all of a sudden, as soon as the building is occupied, introduces that growth immediately in the neighborhood. So I think there's a bit more of a sort of an even spreading of the population over the neighborhoods. The geography that we showed you across the city is pretty big, and so we also know that there is a number of neighborhoods that actually had declined in population. The recent census data that was released by Statistics Canada tells us that we do have some parts of neighborhoods that really don't house the same number of people as they used to in sort of the boom times of families raising kids. So it's something that we've been working with our divisional partners on. Lillian mentioned an infrastructure review in terms of servicing, and the school boards monitor their pupil counts very diligently. So we think that this is the degree of growth that can be managed and spread out across the city.
John, any thoughts on that before we go on to next questions? I'm not sure he heard me. John, do you have any thoughts on that before we go on to next questions?
No, I think I think I've said enough for now. I think we could maybe just get on to the regular folks.
All right, let's get to the audience. Jesse, do we have any hands up?
No, we don't, but we have several good questions in the Q&A. And I think this one question from Donna Owens is the very first one. She's wondering if there are other urban centers in Canada that have gone through a similar process. That could be a very helpful question to address.
Sure, I can take that one. So at the very outset of our study, our team set about looking at other models and examples across North America. But we are very mindful, of course, that we want to sort of stay local. So, we do have examples in Minneapolis and parts of California, but what we also found were how Vancouver and Edmonton and Ottawa were also tackling this question. So we kind of took a look at their approaches and took back some lessons learned to apply to the Toronto context and sort of develop our approach for moving forward with this. And I think we're aware of Mississauga is also having a look at this question as well through their own municipal comprehensive review, just a little bit closer to home. So really, like within the Ontario context, which is the legislation that we work under, there are other jurisdictions that we can learn from and may learn from us too.
And then Melanie, since we did that research, Vancouver released their draft official plan, I think last month, where they're proposing multiplexes in every zone in Vancouver. That would be the least dense zone.
All right. Thanks for that. Jesse, let's go to the next question.
Sure. I think this would go specifically to the person who wrote the words, but the prevailing character. Stephen Boyle has a couple questions about that. The comment attached to the question. So it says, I don't believe you can keep the existing character of a neighborhood when trying to address this housing issue with multiplex housing. The whole point is to do things differently and thus create a new neighborhood character. So how would we address this housing issue while maintaining the prevailing character, or should we shift to a new character of a neighborhood?
Good question. If it was up to me, currently I only have one vote, so we'll see how this all shakes down. But I would do it carefully. I would have any. I don't think neighborhoods should stay static. I don't think we should try to freeze, 1958 or 1972 or 1991. I think you do need to respond to the housing crisis. So what I was looking for in this was more units in the same built form. If you would create and I was looking for something fairly modest with that within neighborhoods. Like, I'm sure David Crombie wouldn't mind me telling this story, but I was on a bus tour a couple of years ago with a group of councillors and planners and urban thinkers and some local residents that I invited along. And we stopped at David Crombie's house, and David's one of my all-time favorite politicians. And he hopped on the bus and he said, I want to talk to you about where I live. And he pointed to a house over across the street. And he said, I live on the main floor. My adult daughter, who was recently widowed, lives on the second floor. 2 of her adult children live on the third floor. And a friend of mine lives in the basement. And we love it. We all look after each other, and, life is great. And a couple of the people on the bus, Willowdale residents, who were, kind of resisting change, and I specifically invited them along for that reason, said, that's great. Can we do that? One said, could I do that? And the other said, I'd love to have that across the street from me instead of, two people living in a 4,000 square foot house. I think that would give me my neighborhood back. So, I'm very much in favor of that kind of change that would allow multi-generational housing or, just different options for, um, you know, people who couldn't dream of buying a great big Willowdale house to still live in a part of a house in Willowdale, either as rental or ownership. So I'm in favor of that kind of change. I think you have to do it really carefully so you don't have the unintended consequences of just creating more land speculation and people not building what we're wanting to change the rules to create. But I think mainly you need to focus on certain streets, and there's lots of those streets, and there's lots of those streets in Willowdale. There's lots of those streets across the city, and you pick out the places where you want to give something a try, and you do, very modest change within the neighborhoods, much more modest than is what is being proposed here. And if you're going to propose something more along the lines of what is being proposed here, you do it carefully and in selected locations. That would be my answer.
All right. Any thoughts from the staff team on that before we move on?
I can have just a comment and
go ahead,
Councillor Filion. Oh, sorry, Melanie. Just a comment on the careful upzoning. The growth we've seen in the city has been where we have hotspots of tremendously high densities and then low-rise densities. And arguably, you could say that the single detached neighborhoods have become so out of reach to someone who is maybe my age, maybe a bit older, people who could not get into the housing market in many, many years ago. They won the age lottery, as people say, right? I think the upzoning can create issues with land speculation. So you're going to be, if you only identify certain sites, for example, that has special zoning permissions and others don't, those would be more in demand. And that can create further unintended consequences, which is why equalizing permissions is the equitable way to go. Sorry, Melanie, I interrupted you.
No, that's fine, Melina, of course. And I think the situation you described, Councillor Filion, that David Crombie had described to you was exactly what we're trying to accomplish here. And, I think, again, the devil will be in the details of the zoning, and that work is still ongoing. So I don't want us to get, too caught up in the specter of four stories when the zoning diagrams that we're working with are very much in line with what's permitted today. And we recognize that's important. And we're hearing that in the consultations that Lillian's been leading for the last few months.
All right. And that discussion of the details will continue. Jesse, let's go to the next question.
Okay. The short question, can you share your view on how prevailing character supports a changing city? It's a slightly different angle onto the topic, and that might be for you, John. And this comes from Leah Mandelson.
Yeah, so I think you, again, don't have a one size fits all for the entire yellow belt across the city. There may need to be a number of prevailing characters. And I'm not opposed to, tinkering with the wording of that section of the official plan. I am opposed to turning it upside down.
All right. I guess with that, we can go on to the next question, Jesse.
Okay, so we have no hands up. So if anyone wants to ask a question, I'd be happy to unmute you and let you ask your question in person. Otherwise, we're going to go to another question from Kathy Smith. It starts with a story. My parents bought in 1949 in Willowdale. I am the owner now. It is a small 1.5 story. There is no longer any character in this area other than McMansions, a term I know, John, you've used. I fully support multi-units. My concerns are keeping the softscaping and parking. How would you address someone who's inherited a home and is living in a neighborhood that is tremendously different than what they grew up in?
I'm not clear who that's directed to. I guess I would ask person what it is they're. I'm not quite
I
clear what
think
she would like to do.
I think the bigger concerns here are about softscaping, sort of landscaping around units. What provisions are in place to make sure that um, we have green space, with the possibility of larger buildings coming in. How are we addressing parking if we have, multiplexes coming into the neighborhood? Suburban neighborhoods, of course, remain far more car-centric than downtown neighborhoods, and that's perhaps a really good example of how the policies would really differ a lot from one neighborhood to the next. Is how walkable are those neighborhoods, or are residents more likely to want to find parking spaces? So perhaps we could just sort of get into those two areas of the policy, sort of how this might impact sort of greenery, greenscaping, landscaping around these types of built forms, and how we might tackle the parking issues.
Sure. So maybe I can start this one. So in terms of the softscaping and landscaping, we're proposing to maintain the same softscaping requirements within the current zoning. And like Melanie has said, we haven't figured out the exact zoning parameters yet, but we're working with the same rear yard, front yard, and side yard setbacks that currently exist in the zoning as a starting point. We're not really looking to change these things. In terms of the parking, the citywide minimum parking requirements were removed for this type of development back in November of 2021. But what that means is that someone can build parking, they're just not required to build parking. So we fully expect that multiplexes in more car-dependent areas, as you mentioned, Marcus, there would still be continuing to be parking in those places, but it would be up to the owner or developer of the building how much parking to provide.
And I
Can I just add to
Sorry, let's go John and then Lillian.
Yeah. So, I think obviously, I think it would be difficult to maintain the same level of green space, but you're going to have to sacrifice something. So if you have a semi-detached, for example, you may have a little bit less if green space than if you had two singles, but not terribly different on the parking. I think the reality is you're going to need to have street parking on, which we don't currently have in Willowdale. It's kind of counter to the Willowdale culture, but I think it would be inevitable that if you allow multiplex, that you're also going to end up with some form of permit parking. I know some people would be very opposed to that. I don't think it's personally. I don't think it's a terrible thing. But again, it's part of the reason I would like to introduce this sort of a lot more gradually. Let's try it out. Let's see how it works. How many people moving into these units, if they're built that if it's fairly close to a main street, perhaps most of the people moving in will not own a car, so that won't be a problem, or most still have a car because they need it to go to work in Mississauga or wherever, or to Vaughan, and we need to figure out where they're going to park their cars. I don't think you can, it would be pretty difficult to build multiplex housing that looked attractive if you were to have, parking pads and garages and stuff like that. I think to make this kind of look good in the neighborhood, you're going to need to, not have garages and people, some people will need to park on the street. That would be my prediction and my view on it.
Okay, Lillian wanted to jump in with a thought.
Yes. Thank you so much, Marcus. What I wanted to point out was, EHON is kind of a package program, and one of the pieces of the package is locally serving retail and non-residential uses. So, for example, if you were to need something like, a bag of milk or something at 10 p.m. at night, you might want to jump into your car and drive somewhere. But if there was a locally serving retail around the corner from you, you could just pop by and get it yourself. That's part of the whole 15-minute city idea that we're also trying to introduce across the city, where, people don't have those options these days. Right now, people are auto-dependent because of the suburban nature of some communities. This is what we're proposing to change through EHON as part of an entire package of, the evolving needs of communities, the evolving neighborhoods as well, and the needs in communities where you might need something where you don't need a car. And when we talked about the removal of parking minimums in November 2021, the idea was to reduce auto dependency as one of our climate action goals. As part of Transform TO, which is also an initiative that is supported by City Council. So these all contribute to making greener, more sustainable communities.
All right. I just wanted to pull out one last question from the Q&A. I'm seeing a hand up that we'll get to before we wrap up. But we talked about sort of green space around buildings. There's a question from Lila about TRCA regulations. There are a number of areas in Willowdale that back onto ravines and protected lands by TRCA that may be a barrier to building larger forms than currently exist. Supportive of protecting green areas, but curious to know whether there's been any work balancing those two priorities in any areas that are TRCA protected.
I guess that's a relatively simple answer. No, we are not changing TRCA regulations. I don't think that we actually have the power to change TRCA regulations.
Okay, we'll leave it with that.
We do have a hand raised from Stephen Boyle, and he'd love to ask a question if there was time permits.
Fantastic. We will make time for Stephen Boyle. Good evening, Steve.
Hi. Thanks everybody for being involved in this. It's a very important topic, and I've had lots of conversations with our neighbors on this. And being a relatively long-term Willowdale resident, I just want to put a little context before I ask the question. So I moved in 2020, and lots of condo development, which is fine. John's alluded to it, but what we've seen is you change a zoning, or there's zoning in place, zoning bylaws that are in place, and then you have small, mid-sized developers come along, they target neighborhoods, and they absolutely change the face of the neighborhood. They push the envelope, they take it to the OMB, or now the Land Tribunal. They argue it's for affordable housing. It's not, it's for profit. They change the community for the worse. They profit, they leave, and these houses are in disrepair 5 years later. And the residents who have bought those places at exorbitant prices are left with no recourse. That's been my reality around changing the neighborhoods. And I can tell you, just from a feedback and context perspective, you get a lot of that NIMBYism and pushback because there's a lot of people that are disillusioned with the public institutions that are supposed to be looking out for, quote unquote, complete communities. What we're seeing now, which is I'm speaking on behalf of a lot of the people that own single detached homes that want to see young families move in, but they simply can't afford to move into a $3.5 million single detached home. And they're worried that what a developer is going to do is come along, to John's point, push the envelope, get approved for a 4-story, not a 3-story, doesn't fit as nicely as planned, and charge $1 million per unit and profit even more. All the time being, we've got the Young Corridor. We've got Centerpoint Mall that's got a proposal for 22 buildings, 18 high rises, 4 mid rises between 12 and 50 stories. We're talking about one development that is almost 50% of our current population in John's ward. And that's one of many that are popping up. That's the context I just wanted to frame up before I ask city staff on what is the data on the ability of communities to absorb intensification. My kids play on the street. If we lose, our ability to just go out in the front to play in the streets, where's the capacity for other community centers? Like, we can't get our kids into any of the city-run programs in its current state. And we're talking about adding all of this. I just don't know where the data, I don't have no confidence, I guess, and not alone in this comment. I have no confidence in the city's ability to absorb widespread, gentle intensification with my experience of these developers coming in for profit and completely changing communities. And that's the big worry that a lot of people have, and where I think you're getting a lot of people that are not in my backyard pushback on stuff like this.
Thanks for that, Steve. It sort of echoed some of the questions I was asking towards the end in terms of linkages between, what we're discussing here and how that fits into the bigger picture of, other forms of intensification that are coming in and pressures that already exist today. Parents certainly, but, I think people of all ages that are expressing those sorts of fears and concerns and, how we manage that. So, just based on the clock, I'm going to go to
Markus.
Yeah.
Sorry, can I just respond to that very briefly?
Yeah, of course. I was going to ask you all to do that sort of in the context of wrapping up, but go ahead, Lillian.
Okay, I just wanted to say I completely understand your point, Stephen, and thank you so much for raising that. As Melanie mentioned earlier, sometimes when you have these high-intensity developments coming up in hotspots across the city, there can be infrastructure gaps while community infrastructure catches up. The school boards need pupils in seats before they can even apply for provincial capital funding to expand schools, to add to add more with seats, etc., etc. But I completely understand. What I want to say is we also need to think about all of those people who cannot presently find accommodations at all in the city, who are being forced to leave the city of Toronto because they cannot find affordable rental units. And the loss of talent and the loss of in some ways the future of the city. What is our city going to look like if young families are leaving to go to Brantford and Wasaga Beach? I don't know, like all of these places where people have been buying houses during the pandemic. What does our city look like in the future when people just leave because they can't afford to live here anymore? When retail workers and daycare providers can't afford to pay rent, are living in really substandard housing conditions. So we need to ask ourselves those questions as well when we think about what we're doing here through this program and what we're doing as part of the entire housing action plan that we need to tackle in the housing crisis.
Lillian, I think you've just summed up the crux of the debate between, those that are so desperate to find housing, and those that are currently living in neighborhoods wondering, what's the livability of those neighborhoods going to be like if we are, cramming people in with a shoehorn rather than planning, true complete communities that offer the services and amenities that our residents rely on, and trying to figure out how that works. I think, one of the things that Steve raised was, where is the data that shows us, those linkages? Where can I look on a map and see how my neighborhood stacks up against others in the city in terms of, not only school spaces, but community center capacity and parks per resident and all of those sorts of things, roadway capacity, transit capacity, sewage capacity. I think a lot of those questions in Willowdale have been asked for the last 20, 30 years, right? This is an area where, growth has been significant for a much longer period of time. So because we haven't caught up over those 20, 30 years and are now, facing this affordability crisis, there are a lot of residents like Steve asking those questions. And I think they're good ones that are going to shape this debate as we move forward. So, thank you, Steve, for those thoughts, and to the team. I'm going to ask staff if you have any closing thoughts tonight as we wrap this up, and then we'll ask John to do the same.
I wanted to say I wanted to post a link to the official plan amendment in the chat, but then I realized we don't have a chat. So if you would like to view our official plan amendment, you can go to the EHON website. So that's toronto.ca/EHON. And our official plan amendment for multiplexes is right at the top. And thank you, everyone, for your time tonight.
Thank you so much, Philip. And closing thoughts from you, John.
Yes, so there's going to need to be a lot of discussions about this in the coming months and years. This will be coming to council, I believe, in is it June or July? July, right?
Yeah.
July. Yeah. So, I am not supporting it in its current form, but I'm very interested in thoughts from residents. Unfortunately, we spent a lot of time with the presentation tonight, which I think we needed to, because it's not a simple issue, and I think we have brought out both sides of it. We haven't necessarily solved any problems or reached any conclusions, and I think that's going to require further thought or study. Very interested in hearing from any residents who were on the meeting tonight. If you want to email or whatever, I think I'd really be interested in what people are thinking. And thanks again for coming out. Thanks, Markus and panelists.
I do imagine this may be a topic in an upcoming John Filion e-newsletter. For those that aren't subscribed, John puts out a community e-newsletter every 2 weeks on Fridays and talks about a lot of local issues and events and things that are affecting our community and city. So certainly encourage anybody that isn't subscribed to do so at johnfilion.ca. And I think John will probably be leading some virtual engagement through that medium over the coming weeks. Of course, staff have also talked about their ongoing consultation efforts, and we'll make sure that those links get included in our e-newsletter as well. I want to encourage all of our residents to participate in that project process, because this is a very big discussion and one that is going to shape the future look and feel of our neighborhoods in a very profound and important way. So I want to thank the staff for joining us tonight. Melanie, Philip, Lillian, it's been so wonderful having your insights with us. And braving some of these comments and perhaps criticisms that have been coming back. But I think it's these discussions and debates that really create that vibrant process that's so important. John, thank you so much for helping to put this on tonight, along with Catherine LeBlanc-Miller and Jesse James, who have been working with me on the back end tonight. And of course, thanks to our audience, because without you guys, we couldn't do any of this. So we really appreciate your questions and for being engaged members members of our community and part of this conversation. We'll be having one final Let's Talk Willowdale event in 2 weeks. It will be talking about parks and amenities in a growing vertical community and how we create those linkages and the types of amenities we need to make our neighborhood as livable as it can possibly be. So thanks again, everybody, for being a part of this. Wishing you all a great night, and we'll see you next time. Good night.